This is a story about my mother, Deborah Sykes, and her gardens. To first understand my mother's passion for growing things outside, we have to begin with explaining how she was raised. My grandmother and her sisters lived close to each other out in the country, as we all in the family call it. Their homes are a ways out of town in the middle of nowhere, when that town already has a middle of nowhere feel to it. However, my family never needed much because they always had ways of keeping busy. My great-granddad was a sharecropper, which meant that my granddad began working at the age of 14. He would move on to work for a factory for 40 years until he retired at the age of 65. So while my granddad worked the majority of his life to take care of the family, my grandmother, mother, great-aunt, and aunts tended to their gardens. My mother recalls hating garden at a young age, which is a sentiment we both share. The diligence and patience required to tend to crop and flowers in the brutal and unforgiving heat of Mississippi growing and harvesting seasons is not something that you would imagine most teenagers would have. However, over time, gardening became a part of her. It was just our way of life, she said with a warm sense of nostalgia. My mother's gardens have taken on a few different forms over the course of my life. We live in the city limits of Winona, Mississippi, and in my neighborhood and many of the neighborhoods nearby, there aren't any gardens. However, my mother had one of her own in our backyard. Her first was mostly just flowers with a few tomato plants, and as a kid, I remember being in awe of the lively colors. She grew sunflowers, lilies, and these very large plants that I would always play with and call elephant ears. She would always say, "Don't break my plants." My hands weren't always as careful as hers. The next form that my mother's gardening took was one that was an extension of her strong faith in the community project. Across from our house lies a ditch, and across from that ditch lies a big field owned by a man named Mr. Jeff Rogers. When my mother was considering where she could put this new garden, he just up and offered his plot of land. This act of kindness led to the Seed of Unity Garden. She began with hopes of getting different churches and kids working together in the garden. However, things don't always go as planned. After struggling to get commitment from other groups, she eventually just used it to get the youth of our church outside and giving back to the community. They would deliver the first of their crops to the elderly and poor in the town. They grew cucumbers, corn, squash, yams, watermelon, cantaloupes, greens, tomatoes, and other foods. The Seed of Unity may not have sown the unity that it originally set out to do, but it was still able to bring good to others. Through the years, as the youth of the church have grown up, my mother has lost a lot of the help that she used to have. Now it's mostly our immediate family that tends to the garden. My mother will still take vegetables to some of the elderly in town, demonstrating the same values of diligence and hard work that she learned in the fields with my grandmother, who will still to this day get out in the garden to work. When I'm out and about in Winona, I sometimes will get a, "Tell Miss Deborah that I want to come and get something out of her garden." I chuckle thinking of how something she hated as a kid has almost become her reputation. On the weekends, I will sometimes get a call from my aunt or my cousin, and they are looking for my mother. They say, "She must be in the garden," already knowing the answer to their question. And that is the image of my mother that will always stick with me. A woman of faith, walking up and down the rows, patiently, diligently, tending